Hello and welcome to this Tuesday's morning market briefing. We've got lots to talk about, but firstly, Sweden overcomes final hurdle to join NATO in historic shift, as well as that largest US supermarket deal has been caught in a Biden antitrust crackdown. We've got lots to talk about on the charts. Also, with lots happening on the economic calendar, but we'll come to that near the end, so make sure you stay around so you see that. Before we get straight into it, though, make sure to subscribe. The first article to talk about is on the topic of Sweden and NATO. Now, a vote in the Hungarian parliament takes Sweden over its last hurdle to NATO membership. This comes following Hungary's parliament voting on Monday to approve the application. Now, this is not the first time, of course, that we've spoken about Hungary, Sweden, and the Russian invasion into Ukraine as a whole. Now, obviously, Russia did invade Ukraine near the start of 2022, and since then we've seen a fallout across Europe in the way that many different nations have responded to the war. With most nations within the West, within the EU, and within NATO responding to the invasion of Ukraine through a way to support Ukraine. And offering up humanitarian aid as well as lethal aid to Ukraine. We've seen, of course, certain air-to-air kind of assets being provided, whilst also, certain assets on the ground also being provided. And then, of course, the basic humanitarian aid and financial aid that we've seen being provided. All of this has, resulted in, Ukraine being able to hold itself against Russia, really, which was seen as, kind of the superpower opposing the West within Europe. So kind of to see Ukraine be able to defend against such a large enemy such as Russia for the West is, of course, a great surprise to many, and largely does also come at come thanks to certain Western support, which, as we've spoken about most recently, is beginning to wane, of course. Now, here we are talking about Sweden, though, and of course Finland, I believe last year, or if not the year before, has already joined NATO. And Sweden and Finland were supposed to join at the same time, two Scandinavian countries which were holding their neutrality prior to this war. Ultimately, Russia's invasion into Ukraine did trigger both such nations to start worrying for their own safety, and as a result, look to join NATO. And that is why we are now seeing, Finland within NATO and now Sweden hopefully joining. But ultimately, what's been kind of interesting about this scenario is the fact that Finland was allowed to join when I said, but ultimately Sweden has kind of been prevented and blockaded for quite some time now, to the detriment and annoyance of many Swedish officials, which were trying to make sure that this went through. And the two key players, the two key nations, which have kind of been restricting Sweden's access to NATO and accession to NATO, is of course Viktor Orban for Hungary, and of course Erdogan. I've pronounced that really poorly, but of course Turkey's leader as well, Erdogan. Who is kind of put up a fight against Sweden, really, due to certain issues with the ethnic Kurd population within certain regions of Syria, Iraq, and of course Turkey. And so we have seen certain tensions flare up within NATO. Not long ago we were talking about Hungary also holding up EU funding for Ukraine most recently, but also we're of course talking about now Sweden's issues in joining. But ultimately, it does seem now like Sweden will be allowed to join NATO, and this, of course, will provide a historic shift within the alliance, and ultimately, will affect markets greatly, if not immediately, but going into the future. This all affects world tensions greatly, and at a time where Russia's invading into Ukraine, we've got the Middle East tensions flaring up. And of course, we always have China invading Taiwan on the horizon. we do have to look at these situations, and kind of try and incorporate them into the bigger picture and think about how that might affect world tensions. As of course, an event like this may drive world tensions higher due to the fact they may anger Russia further into maybe, another sort of offensive conflict, or using like more, destructive weapons within Ukraine. And all of this could definitely affect markets greatly, with of course if we do see escalations take place, whether that be in the Middle East, or with Russia even further, or China and Taiwan, we could definitely see gold skyrocket to the upside, of course. But also other assets as well, European equities, and even US equities will all be affected by these kind of world tensions shifts. Now, since Russia's invasion into Ukraine, both Sweden and Finland have joined NATO. This new entry into NATO now gives the alliance control over almost all of the entire Baltic Sea. This objective is not only hindered by the Russian territory of Kaliningrad, but the strategic pardon me, I'm not kind of reading this right. Now, this objective is only hindered by the Russian territory of Kaliningrad, but the strategically important Swedish island of Gotland is now critical to NATO's defence. When Finland was also admitted, NATO's eastern flank was doubled, and this is as a result of Finland's border, of course, being very, very large indeed, and spanning across a key border with Russia in the more northern territories, of course. Now, the Russian invasion into Ukraine broke the neutrality found in Scandinavia and led many nations such as Sweden and Finland to start thinking about gaining NATO membership. But ultimately, Hungary, however, has provided a significant hurdle for Sweden's membership bid, with Turkey, more importantly, objecting to Sweden's accession, leading to the frustration of Swedish officials. Hungary's objection to Sweden's NATO bid was surprising for most, since Turkey's opposition was understood on the grounds of Sweden's support of the ethnic Kurds. But despite Turkey's opposition, however, Sweden was approved by Turkey after a deal by the US was made to sell them $23 billion worth of F-16 fighter jets. Now, Hungary's opposition to the bid, however, was apparently based on the claims that Sweden had denigrated its democratic standards, which is kind of an odd thing coming from Hungary, of course. So that's all to talk about in this article, though. Very important for world tensions. Definitely keep your eyes on NATO and other sorts of things to do with geopolitics. Next to talk about is to do with US supermarkets, actually. A bit of a surprising article to kind of talk about, but ultimately comes back to Biden's antitrust crackdown and ultimately affects US equities greatly. Now, the Federal Trade Commission is now sued to block Kroger's acquisition of Albertsons. Now, this comes as a threat to the largest supermarket merger in US history and represents once again the latest sign of the Biden administration's crackdown on monopolization. This acquisition was worth $24.6 billion, and the FTC alleged that it would eliminate competition between the two companies whilst harming product quality and consumers. Now, we've spoken about a lot of these now mergers crackdowns by the Biden administration, as the Biden administration has approached the issue of antitrust and monopolies with a very strong hand, kind of promising to crack down against growing monopolies, especially within the tech industry, as we've previously spoken about with Google and other firms, Adobe even as well. But ultimately, this is kind of an interesting situation to talk about, because it's more so related with the more traditional food industry, the more traditional retail industry, and so it's very interesting to see how this Kroger Albertsons deal is kind of being messed with due to Biden's kind of focus at the moment on cracking down on these monopolies or potential monopolies, as they are kind of seeing it as something which could affect consumers, But ultimately, as we come up on, the 2024 presidential election, we always have to think about how significant will this actually be? How much will this help Biden? And that sort of thing. And that's always very important to understand, as, there could be larger issues which maybe Biden should be focusing on. But ultimately, if Biden sees this as a way as him representing his fight against inflation, this could definitely provide some political points for himself. So definitely keep your eyes on kind of that side of things as well. Now, a bipartisan group of 9 attorney generals from numerous regions across the US also alleged that the deal would dent competition for workers and keep worker staff wages lower. Now, once merged, the entity would employ nearly 700,000 staff with 5,000 stores. A Kroger spokesperson, however, responded to the action by the FTC, saying that blocking such a deal would harm America's consumers and workers on the basis that the merger would allow for increased competition, lower prices, and better wages. This all comes at a time where Joe Biden, of course, is attempting to achieve re-election this year and is also attempting to bring inflation down. This is all culminating in a harder stance by the Biden administration against the merger, of course. So very, very important to understand, actually. And it's definitely something to keep your minds on. Because ultimately, if Biden does win, the upcoming election, we could definitely see Biden continue this antitrust crackdown, which could have a detriment on US equities, of course. So keep that in mind and keep looking at anything to do with monopolies within the US, of course. That's all to talk about in this article, though, and the articles as a whole. Next to talk about, of course, is the charts, where we do have quite a bit to talk about. To begin with, though, we are on the US 30 and talking about US equities as a whole. Now, the US 30 did shoot to the upside most recently, throughout last week, as we spoke about yesterday, where ending off last week, we did see a strong movement to the upside. Ultimately, though, ending off the week on Friday and now entering the week yesterday, we have now seen price kind of stall out and stagnate, and this comes seemingly following this kind of move to the upside that we did see last week. What's interesting to see, though, is the fact that we are at our all-time highs at the moment. So that's something that's very important to note. And currently, it does seem that we're trying to find the bottom of this kind of range, which could be forming around here. We can't be sure, though, of course, since not too much price actions kind of represented itself just yet to allow us to make judgments and that sort of thing. But as I've drawn out yesterday, and I think, or was it the day before, I have drawn out that key Fibonacci retracement tool just to kind of note out those levels which price could always retrace down to. And that sort of thing. And should price retrace down, we've got that 50% and that 61.30 and even that 38.20, which all kind of line up with some key levels of liquidity. Obviously this kind of liquidity box, this area of supply hasn't really been properly drawn. I haven't really put much effort into it, and actually represents what we were more so talking about back at the start of February, but still kind of represents that strong amount of liquidity around that 61.80. And if we look just to the top of that area of liquidity, we have that 50%, so obviously that could be significant. And then further above that, we of course have that 38.20, which lines up with that all-time high before we had this bullish rise. So those are 3 levels which price could retrace to and does have a significant amount of support from. So definitely understand that and keep that on your mind going into this trading week and trading day. Next to talk about is the dollar, which still not too much to talk about. Obviously, we are getting a great deal of US economic data this week, as I spoke about in yesterday's weekly market briefing. So definitely understand that when you're looking at something like the dollar, which of course is very volatile and very reactive to news in relation to the Fed or the US inflation figures or employment figures, pardon me. But ultimately, at the moment, we're not seeing too much happening on the dollar. and we're kind of stagnating, if anything. So, keep your eyes on the dollar, and, try and look for these key liquidity zones where if, new data does come out, if new kind of news does come out, price can react with those areas and move accordingly. Next, talk about, still on the topic of the dollar, of course, is Euro USD, which is in a very interesting position. As we spoke about in yesterday's market briefing, since the 14th of Feb, we've actually started counter trending to the upside, finding some bullish momentum. We still haven't broken above this kind of, most recent high, I guess, in the market. So, understand that when you're looking at where price could move to, but ultimately we're kind of slowly trending to the upside. We're not actually seeing that much volatility up or down, apart from that period, that day of Thursday last week. And aside from that, we're just slowly moving to the upside. So definitely keep your eyes on Euro USD. Some opportunities that could definitely line up are on the charts to be found. And if we just start finding areas of liquidity, we can start to understand why we might be experiencing some sell volume at the moment. Next to talk about, though, is pound yen, which of course, I talk about a lot, and probably is my favorite pair, forex pair. And obviously I've spoken about more recently, the trade that I'm in on pound yen, which I got into on the 14th of Feb from that 38.20 Fibonacci level. Actually, I got into it on Thursday of 15th. But ultimately, since then, we have seen this push to the upside, as we were retesting those all-time highs when we did retest that 38.20, and price is now continuing to the upside. It will be interesting to see whether we can actually fully reach that 27.2% Fibonacci extension level, though, as that will kind of represent price coming to its all-time highs and kind of making this kind of Fibonacci extension movement complete. So definitely keep your eyes on pound yen. We have some yen news. I'm just talking about yesterday's data. We did have the Japanese inflation rate come out, so make sure you've read up on that. When you're looking at something like pound yen, that all affects the charts greatly. Next talk about, though, is Bitcoin, which of course is in a very, very, very interesting spot after having so much volatility recently, and so much bullish momentum altogether. And only yesterday, starting off the week, we did see price push to the upside from this lower level of liquidity and support that had been made in this kind of range, and price has now pushed out of that, broken to the upside, and is broken above the Fibonacci extension level of the minus 27.2. So price is in a very interesting area at the moment, and because we've kind of pushed above that 27 minus 27.2, it's hard to kind of say whether price will retrace or not. So definitely keep your eyes on Bitcoin. Next to talk about is gold. Not too much to say on gold. Obviously, world tensions are greatly affecting it, as well as news to do with the dollar. So keep that in your mind when you're looking at something like gold. And at the moment, price does seem to be ranging between these two areas of liquidity, support and resistance. Lastly, to talk about on the charts, though, of course, is oil, which has found some bullish momentum to the upside after coming into contact with this liquidity zone. But not too much to say on oil, apart from the fact it is continuing to range since the 13th of Feb, really. So keep your eyes on oil. That's all to talk about on the charts, though. Lastly to talk about, of course, is the economic calendar. We are getting quite a bit of data today. Well, not actually that much data, but some important data nonetheless. Now, firstly, we will be getting German and French consumer confidence figures, as well as the US durable goods orders figure, as well as US house price index figures, and a Fed official's speech today. So all very important to listen out for. And finally, we're getting the US consumer confidence figure as well. So lots of very important US data, but also some important Eurozone data littered in there as well. So listen out for all of that. Hope you have a great trading day, but that's all from us at Wildwood Capital. Have a great one. See you later. Bye.